Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our seminar Geopolitical Tuesday. I would like to thank especially Professor Frédéric Bozo from Sorbonne Nouvelle, University Paris-X for accepting our invitation. I'm very happy to welcome you to his lecture entitled France, Germany and Europe Between Two Elections. For our audience on the Zoom, please turn off your microphones and cameras. And for your information, this conference is recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel. My name is Kinga Torbicka. I'm the research fellow at the Center of French Culture and Francophone Studies at the University of Warsaw. At the beginning, I will present our cycle, methods and criteria of class evaluation. And after, I will present our guest. Then his lecture will start, and afterward, we invite you to question and answer session with our guest. Our cycle, Geopolitical Tuesday, is an open conference for students and for public. The seminar is organized by the Center of French Culture and Francophone Studies at the University of Warsaw, the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies, and the Polish Association of the International Studies in cooperation with Groupe, vous, politiques, Ecole, normale, supérieure in Paris. Since 2019. The aim of the cycle is to familiarize the public with selected issues of geopolitics in Europe and in the world, to show different research approaches explaining the essence of these processes and phenomena, and to discuss their impact on events in Europe and in the world. We invite the French researchers to present their works. Seminar coordinators are the Director Nicolas Masłowski, Director of Center of French Culture and Francophone Studies, Tomasz Łukaszuk, Ambassador and member of Faculty of Political Science and International Studies, and me. Now I will present shortly methods and criteria for class evaluation for our students. The final grade will be issued on the basis of presence. One absence is allowed, essays and activity during the classes. The deadline for submitting works is the 10th of May 2022. The essay should contain 6 pages in English, the structure of scientific work, and should be related to the topic of our meetings during this semester, and must be sent by email to one of coordinators to this cycle. Now, let me present our guest, Professor Frédéric Bozo. You are a professor at the Sorbonne Nouvelle Paris-X University, where you teach contemporary history at the university's Institute for European Studies. Your focus is on French foreign and security policy, France-European policies, European integration, and transatlantic relations, and Cold War history. You were educated at the Ecole normale, supérieure and Sciences Po at Paris, and you hold your PhD from the University of Paris-X Nanterre and obtained your habilitation at the Sorbonne Nouvelle. Thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation. Today, Professor Frédéric Bozo will approach the relations between two important countries in Europe, between France and Germany. His lecture will discuss the present status of this relation in the wider European framework, both in the current political context in both countries and in a larger historical perspective. Recent years have displayed a degree of Franco-German agreement unseen since 3 decades. Is this likely to continue beyond the current sequence of events? So after the lecture, we invite you to question and answer session. You could write your comments or questions on the chat. And now I invite Professor Frédéric Bozo to present his lecture. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Kinga. It's a pleasure to be with you, although I would have preferred to be physically there, but this was not possible this time. So thank you for inviting me to discuss.
Yes, you were my professor at the Sorbonne Nouvelle.
Yes, very much so, I remember. You know, we decided that I would discuss Franco-German relations and European construction. Of course, there is an elephant in the room as we speak, which is the Ukraine crisis, which could change many things, confirm things, or reverse trends. And we can discuss that in the Q&A session. But Kinga and I have decided that we should keep it the way it was. Decided, that is, discuss Franco-German relations. So, I'm aware it's like discussing architecture while Rome burns, but let's proceed this way and discuss perhaps the surrounding events in the Q&A session. So the talk is about Franco-German relations between two elections, because, of course, the German elections of last September and the upcoming French elections in April are, of course, very important, both for the bilateral relationship and for the European setting as a whole. And so we thought it would make sense to discuss the current status of the Franco-German relationship at the time of this, electoral transition in both countries. But of course, we need to discuss this issue in a much larger historical terms. So what I want to do is first to take stock of the current situation by, looking back a few years back where we come from in that relationship and where we are. Then I want to take, look at the short-term or medium-term issues that need to be discussed in order to analyze where the relationship is heading. And finally, I would like to ask myself, what the structural long-term issues are in that relationship, which remains both, still very central to European integration, to the European setting, and also a difficult relationship, even though, as we said, this relationship has never been so good since perhaps 3 decades. And I want first to start by exploring the present constellation and ask myself, why are the planets aligned for France, Germany, and Europe? And it's important to understand where we come from and what happened to make that situation so positive as it is today. The first explanation, of course, is what I would describe as the Macron factor. It's important to remember that only 10 years ago, the Franco-German relationship was highly problematic. So let me offer a very simplified narrative of what has happened over the past 2 decades. In a nutshell, I would say that after the end of the Cold War and German unification until roughly 2000, 2002 or 3, there was no dramatic perception of Franco-German imbalance or decoupling or problem, mostly because Germany was absorbed by its reunification and the EU was still in the post-Maastricht dynamic. With the coming into place of the euro, with ESDP coming into place after 2000. There were, of course, traditional frictions between France and Germany, like at the Nice summit of 2000, but these appeared surmountable. And most of all, in 2003, there was the impression that the two countries were really seeing eye to eye. The Iraq crisis of 2003, so France and Germany united against the war, the US-UK-led war. Both countries seemed to be in agreement about, the need to revamp the fiscal rules of the Eurozone. Both countries were in deficit procedures. And so there was an illusion, I would say, of convergence. I'm saying illusion because retrospectively, there was no convergence. And in fact, 2003 really was the beginning of problems for the Franco-German relationship. It was soon clear that the Iraq agreement was not really an agreement. the German attitude was really driven by anti-intervention. The French attitude was as usually Gaullist, and there was no real agreement on the reasons why the two countries opposed the Iraq War. We can discuss that if you want. And of course, in 2003, Germany adopted the Agenda 2020, which was a huge effort at strengthening German competitiveness in a context of increased globalization. And so this was the start of a Franco-German economic gap that only grew larger and larger over the subsequent decade. And indeed, the Euro crisis that started in 2008 or 9 marked the beginning of almost a decade of Franco-German disconnect and I would say European impasse. In spite of Sarkozy's, who was then president of France, attempt at keeping the Franco-German engine alive under the Merkozy guise, there were, it was very clear that France could only basically align itself on Germany and its orthodox policies at a time when France was increasingly weakened financially and economically. Remember, in 2012, right before the presidential election, France lost its AAA ranking, showing that France was in hardship with regard to the economic crisis, whereas, of course, Germany was thriving. And François Hollande's, Macron's predecessors, mandate of 2012-17 coincided, I would say, with the low point of Franco-German relation in the early 21st century. Hollande had been elected with the proclaimed ambition to reorient Europe towards growth policies, but he failed to do so, of course. And France's basically economic and financial crisis was only getting worse under his mandate, leading, I would say, to a serious marginalization of France in the EU, not unlike the situation that had prevailed in 1981, 1983, after François Mitterrand came to power in France and launched a socialist Keynesian economic program, which created very strong difficulties for the relationship between the two countries. There was in 2014 the beginning of a U-turn in Hollande's policies, particularly economic policies, and the beginning of a French adjustment. But it took a while to obtain results, and those results only came in starting in 2016. It was too late for Hollande to profit from those results. And in those years, let's say the mid-2010s, Germany increasingly appeared as the dominant European power in the EU. And again, there was a serious marginalization of France in the EU and even in European geopolitics. Just recall the previous Ukraine crisis of 2014. Well, of course, there was the Normandy format that was set up at that time, but it was mainly a German show of dealing with the crisis, with the blessing of the US. France, of course, was busy elsewhere, in the Sahel in particular. But it was, I would say, a rather unprecedented period of French absence from the Europe scene. And of course, Macron comes in at that time with a double-pronged policy on which he bases his bid for the presidency in 2017. First, internal reform, of course. Again, there's a parallel here with 1983 when Mitterrand decided to keep the franc in the European monetary system and adopt orthodox policies of stabilization. And of course, the idea was for Macron was to give tokens of his willingness to reform France, adjust the economy in order to give more European credibility to France's European policies. And it worked. Of course, there were hitches. There was the yellow vest episode in 2018, 2019. But basically, Macron successfully quelled the crisis. And the same with the COVID crisis, which started pretty bad in France. But eventually, the early difficulties were overcome. And so I would say that overall, Macron's strategy of regaining the upper ground on the European scene pretty well worked. And and France really gained a new credibility on the European scene thanks to its economic policies of reform, its Europhile discourse, etc. And of course, don't forget that Macron was elected in 2017 with a clear win against the populist Marine Le Pen by 66% against 33%, which of course gave him legitimacy to pursue very aggressive European policies, which he did. And the result of this was a very clear French re-engagement in the EU and a French renewed influence in the EU. And in a sense, the 2019 European elections and the designation of the Commission, the President of the Council, even the Parliament itself showed a renewed French influence in the EU. An influence that was unseen, I would say, since the time of the Delors Commission in 1985, 1990. So what happened on the German side of the equation? Of course, the German response to the French overtures was characteristically slow, but in the end decisive. And of course, it was boosted by the geopolitical context, with again here similarities with the 1980s. First of all, at first, of course, there was procrastination, as often is the case in German politics. The German response to Macron's Sorbonne speech of 2017 was very slow, complicated by the setting up of the coalition in Berlin after Merkel's third election, and of course Merkel's traditional reluctance to change course and her famously cautious approach to politics made the whole process very slow. And for example, the new Franco-German treaty, the Aachen Treaty, which was signed in 2019, came a year later than expected in Paris. So there was much procrastination in Berlin until 2019, 2020. But of course, the COVID crisis was a game changer. And of course, future historians will have to tell that story. But the main event was Merkel's conversion to a massive recovery plan in spring, summer 2020. But the question, of course, here is, why did this happen and how? Now, you can say the fundamental German interest was to preserve the EU from faltering as a result of the COVID crisis. But it's hard for me to imagine that this happened without a very strong pressure applied by Macron on Merkel in the spring of 2020. In essence, saying either we change the rules and we inject massive funds in the recovery of Europe post-COVID, or there's a serious risk of the EU crumbling altogether. The economic argument was pretty obvious. This was a symmetric shock that did not allow for procrastination. And the political argument was also fairly clear. It was just impossible not to show solidarity faced with a threat that was of no one's making, unless, unlike some would say the debt crisis of the early 2010s, which was the result of neglect by some nation states. COVID, of course, was nobody's fault. And so the very raison d'etre of the EU would have been in jeopardy had there been no solidarity faced with that threat in dealing with COVID and, of course, in dealing with the post-COVID recovery. And so the third step, I would say, of this new Franco-German entente was the German election of past September, which has, which led to the coming to power of a coalition that was more openly favorable to the French approach to the EU and to Franco-German relations than at any time since the 1980s. And this, of course, is shown in the compact that was signed by the coalition. In terms of the European agenda, the new German coalition embraced the new vision of strategic autonomy that was promoted by Macron, both in terms of geoeconomics, more fiscal solidarity, industrial policies, etc., and of course in geopolitical terms, strategic compass, for example. And even though there was no actual commitment to make, for example, next generation EU a permanent feature of the EU, there was an apparent openness to modify fiscal rules by saying that the Maastricht rules have already proven flexible, etc., etc. So there was a clear willingness by the German coalition to meet Macron and to basically espouse his vision of where to go from here. In addition, I would say the body language of the new coalition, of the new chancellor, was extremely favorable to France and Franco-German relations. That was very clear when Scholz came to Paris for his first visit in December, and in his early declarations, his first government declaration in December. And this, of course, also was reminiscent of past Franco-German episodes. When, for example, Mitterrand in 1983 held his speech in the Bundestag, which was seen as being in strong support of Helmut Kohl just before the election of March 1983. Well, the same can be said of Scholz's performance in basically showing unity with Macron just 2 or 3 months before the presidential election. So there's a clear political choice in Berlin that Macron needs to be reelected, and it shows. And of course, this has a strong importance in Franco-German relations and in Europe. So the result of this is that France, Germany, and Europe are arguably, in the most favorable situation since the late 80s, when Kohl and Mitterrand relaunched the community leading up to Maastricht, when the Franco-German engine was at its strongest, after a few years of being basically in an impasse after Mitterrand's election of 81. And in a sense, I would say that Macron appears as Mitterrand's true heir in terms of European policies and Franco-German relations. So to conclude on the current situation, I would say that this European and Franco-German moment can be interpreted in a sense as the delayed spillover effect of Maastricht. Basically, Maastricht was when it was done in 1991, 1992, especially EMU, were unfinished business, and the leaders of the time knew it. Mitterrand knew that we had created a monetary union without an economic and political union. But events, played a role in leading to the completion of the EMU. Next generation EU can be seen as the late triumph of Mitterrand in a sense. So spillover eventually worked after 20 years or 25 years. And so what we're seeing today is the delayed effect of decisions that were made 20 or 30 years ago, which have not led immediately to satisfactory consequences, but now are leading to concrete effects. One of the questions, of course, we can ask, and maybe we'll end up there after the talk, at the end of the talk, is whether the new advances of the EU that are being discussed today will lead to a new spillover effect that will have consequences later on. We'll see that at some point. So this was my first point, where we come from and why we are in this arguably very favorable situation of Franco-German relations and in Europe. My second series of remarks has to do with the short and medium-term prospects. Looking at the French election, looking at the French presidency of the EU, or rather the European Council, and beyond, let's say in the next 3 or 4 years of the next French presidential mandate and the current German legislature. So just a few thoughts on the French presidential elections that are coming very quickly in early April. What is at stake for the Franco-German relationship and the EU? Of course, there's a measure of unpredictability. This was very much the case in 2017, which was a very unpredictable election, as we recall. Macron's election was a complete surprise compared with the initial, let's say, list of of contenders. And of course, French politics remain today essentially volatile for a host of reasons which we can discuss, including the French presidential system, the general malaise in Western politics, which also affects France. So there's a high degree, of course, of defiance vis-a-vis political elites in France as elsewhere. Yet I would say, and of course, and finally, and we can discuss that as well, the Ukraine situation does introduce a level of uncertainty as well, and we can discuss that. But I would say that the situation is less volatile than in 2017, when pronounced anti-Europeanism was very high on the agenda, with two of the major candidates then on the extreme right, Marine Le Pen, or the extreme left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, advocating an exit from the euro. And this time, no major candidate advocates such a move. Marine Le Pen no longer does, Jean-Luc Mélenchon no longer does, and even Éric Zemmour, the far-right nationalist, neither of them advocate an exit from the euro, let alone, of course, from the EU. Of course, populist candidates do play an anti-European sentiment by advocating a regain in national sovereignty, which, if effectively implemented, Zemmour's program or Le Pen's program, would probably put France in the same category as Poland or Hungary. In other words, risking a sort of Frexit by stealth. But there is no, I would say, recognized willingness to actually go in that direction of a Frexit. And in addition, at this point at least, there doesn't seem to be a serious risk that Eurosceptic populist candidates carry the day, as there was a risk in 2017 that either Mélenchon or Le Pen would be elected. It's actually quite possible that there might be no populist candidate in the runoff on April 24th. We don't know. And even if there is a runoff, it's likely to be between Macron and either Le Pen or Zemmour. But it's also quite possible that it's going to be Macron against Pécresse, in other words, two mainstream candidates. Why is this situation different from what it was in 2017? Well, of course, I think the main explanation is to the credit of Macron. He has basically succeeded in, reforming France to some extent, at least, and making France more credible in Europe, and at the same time making Europe more accepted in France. It's again a different situation from 2017. I would say there was less of a French risk for Europe than there was in 2017. What about the French presidency? Of course, the French presidency of the European Council coincides with the presidential election, and this is no coincidence, because we know that the French government could have decided to ask for a postponement of the French presidency. Macron did not do that because he believed that he could actually play on this situation by using the presidency as a podium for his continued Europeanism, and also as a showcase for his European and internal successes. And that, of course, has been the plan so far, and that plan has been, I would say, successful until the Ukraine crisis, which of course completely reshuffles the cards and again introduces a measure of unpredictability as to what the effect of that crisis will be on the perception of Macron's European record. But it's fair to say that if you just look at the major dossiers which Macron wants to promote during his presidency, they are on fairly good grounds. The major pieces of legislatures which he wants to push through, the carbon border adjustment mechanism or the digital legislation, All of these, dossiers seems to be fairly advanced. Strategic compass, of course, irrespective of the impact of Ukraine, will also be adopted under the French presidency. So overall, I would say Macron is on pretty safe grounds to make his presidency a relative success. Of course, there will be disagreements. There will be dossiers that won't move ahead, such as the Balkan enlargement or the issue of fiscal and financial rules, which are still too divisive to make headway. But overall, I see no risk that the French presidency should end up in the ditch, even considering the dangerous Ukraine situation. But of course, we need to look beyond the French presidency and ask ourselves, what in the medium term are the prospects for a continued thriving Franco-German relationship in Europe? And let's recall that the next few years will be critical for Europe because of the end of the COVID exception after 2022. And so Europe will be at a crossroads. Either we go back to old rules or we search for new rules post-COVID. The green and digital transitions will be very much on the top of the agenda. So this is going to be a very, very sensitive period, the next 3 to 4 years, where the EU will be at the crossroads. So will the current dynamic continue on the Franco-German level? Once again, my assumption is that either Macron is re-elected or maybe Pécresse. Again, I don't believe there's a serious chance that a populist might be elected. So that's my let's say my bet for this analysis, for the sake of this analysis. So provided that Macron is effectively re-elected, will the present love fest, so to say, between France and Germany continue? And I would argue that this is not necessarily going to be the case. In fact, we should not forget that in the key domains, France and Germany remain, not at odds, but come from different places and have different profiles in Europe, which might make a continuation of the present dynamic not as easy as one would think. If you take economics, for example, Germany, after all, is of course very strong and powerful, but remains vulnerable because of its exposure to external trade, because of its exposure to energy imports, Russia, gas, because of its dependence on US security. This, of course, will continue to make Germany hesitant to go down, the alley that France wants to go down, in terms of making the EU more of a geopolitical power. In addition, giving more financial depth to the EU remains difficult for the Germans for the usual reasons, in spite of the beginning of a cultural change, I would say, away from ordoliberalism in Germany. But it won't be so easy, I think, to go ahead with ambitious plans to transform the EU in financial and economic terms the way the French want to. Regarding the French side of the equation, France, of course, remains, even though it's doing much better than 5 years ago, remains vulnerable as a result of its debt, and that will make it more difficult for France to defend, to support the notion of a more financially cohesive Europe, including with relaxed fiscal rules. And so the two countries, I would bet, would continue to defer on key aspects, such as financial rules, energy. We've seen the quarrel over the green taxonomy, for example, in the past few weeks. There will remain rival countries on key dossiers such as industrial policy, and we can see that today when new projects of reindustrialization are discussed, such as the semiconductor issue, etc. So there's no reason to believe that the Franco-German relationship will be a piece of cake in terms of those dossiers. In strategic terms, in political military terms, the same, I think, is true. There's no reason to believe that both countries will radically change their preferred security paradigms in the coming years. Germany is likely to remain very dependent on NATO and US security guarantees, in spite of the Munich consensus of 2014. Germany keeps a culture of reticence in terms of military engagement, intervention, arms sales. There are still strong elements of anti-nuclear posture in German security policies. There's unease with regard to involvements in places like Mali. On the other hand, France continues to remain adept of strategic autonomy for France and for Europe, remains critical of NATO, of US leadership, remains committed to its nuclear posture. France is likely to seek rapprochement with the UK after the Brexit issue is more or less settled. And so this is likely to remain problematic in terms of how do we make the two countries work together in security and defense, with huge dossiers such as the new combat airplane, arms exports, which are very divisive for the two countries. And of course, in other realms such as migration, there will be, of course, continuing divergences. The current German coalition is rather open to migration. France is increasingly reluctant. So those issues will continue to make Franco-German coordination not as simple as one would hope. And of course, there's the issue of who runs the EU. After all, it would be naive not to see that there is an issue of Franco-German balance in the EU. As I said, in the 2010s, France has been, in an unprecedented way, eclipsed by German leadership. This is clearly something that is not, easily accepted by the French. And so, under the surface, Macron's policies are also about rebalancing Franco-German relations for leadership in Europe. So, I would say that over the next few years, it is not at all sure that we will, have the same very positive context in Franco-German relations that we have had in the past 5 years. But we will see. Finally, and I will stop my talk there. My third point is about looking beyond the short or the medium term issues, and ask myself what are the structural issues in the Franco-German relationship, issues that are historic in nature and are in a way recurrent issues in the Franco-German relationship almost since the creation of European integration in the 50s. Those issues, those structural issues, of course, have always been, with us, and so they don't mean that Franco-German cooperation is not possible, but they remind us that the Franco-German relationship is about reconciling essentially different, if not divergent, postures in Europe integration, and we might see more of this in the next decades to come. I see three issues for the Franco-German relationship in the long run. Again, having in mind the longue durée of Franco-German relations. First, there is the issue of the Franco-German balance of power, which I've already discussed a little bit in my previous remark. But this is, of course, a major issue, and perhaps it's the most important issue. Because the existence of an overall balance between France and Germany, I would submit, is a precondition for the pursuit of European construction. First, because it has always been at the heart of the European project since 1950, the notion that those two nations would be on a par and lead together. And also because I think French public opinion would not durably accept a long-lasting situation in which Germany would dominate Europe. It's clear that Macron has succeeded, as I said, in restoring a measure of overall balance between the two countries. But it's also clear that this remains a rather fragile sentiment at this point. If you recall what happened in France during the early phase of the COVID crisis, when France, probably by happenstance, was struck much more hardly than Germany or even Poland at the time, or Eastern Europe in general, Central Eastern Europe, and France was hit by COVID the way Italy or Spain was. There was an incredible level of soul searching in France. Why is this happening? Isn't this the reflection of France's decline in comparison with Germany, which is doing very well? So all this situation, the COVID situation in 2020, fed a sort of soul searching in France, which with the benefit of hindsight, was not grounded on facts. We now know that the reason why Germany did very well in 2020 had probably nothing to do with better capacities of dealing with the crisis, but simply chance. Germany was simply less hit by COVID than France or Italy were in 2020. But this soul searching in France about the different situations in Germany and France showed that there is still this issue of a certain amount of a certain complex of inferiority in France with regard to Germany. And by the way, the reverse is also true. So this issue of Franco-German balance remains important. Again, I would say if there is no Franco-German balance, there is no European integration possible in the long run. So what are the prospects for such a balance to be kept over the next years and decades? France has done much better over the past 5 years and has redressed that balance. But we are in this paradoxical situation in which I would say the change of paradigm of the EU, which has been prompted by France's proposals to make the EU again a geopolitical, a geoeconomic entity, puts France at risk of being once again overtaken by Germany. The paradox is Germany thrived in let's say in the EU of Maastricht, which was an EU built around the principles of ordoliberalism. Germany, being the main industrial power in the EU, did very well. Now we are moving to an EU that includes industrial policy, that includes more dirigism in a way like France has been advocated for years. And the paradox is that this might be to the benefit of Germany, precisely because Germany is the dominant industrial power in Europe. We see that it will be in a position to attract investments, funding, more than any other country. If you look at issues such as the chips industry, it's very clear that this is going to profit Germany more than any other country. So, in a nutshell, this issue of the economic balance between France and Germany is still an important issue and something that we have to monitor in the years to come. In strategic terms, of course, the balance between the overall balance between France and Germany was also helped by the fact that France kept an edge of strategic superiority with regard to Germany by being a nuclear power, by being a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Well, of course, this is still the case and will remain the case. But this is a status that is increasingly difficult for France to defend in post-Brexit EU. It's more difficult for France to be the sole nuclear power and the sole UN Security Council permanent member in the EU after Brexit, because that status smacks of privilege in an EU that is whose main countries, including Germany, do not enjoy that kind of privileges. So we are in an EU in which France could experience a measure of, I would say, strategic solitude making the balance between the two countries more tricky, simply because France will find it more difficult to defend its again its strategic status as compared with Germany. And again, we are in an era of geoeconomics in which it's more important perhaps to be a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse, than to be a nuclear power. So this will be something that that has to be watched. How will France, successfully keep its strategic edge and make that edge part of the overall balance with Germany? The second issue that will make it, probably difficult to go much, to sustain the present situation of harmony between Germany and France, is what I would call the dilemmas of integration. This is something that is not new. After all, since the 1950s, France has always been in a dilemma in which, on the one hand, France pushed for a cohesive, strong Europe, but at the same time was reluctant to accept I would say, the institutional consequences of that. Supranationality, for example. All the debates on common agricultural policy in the 60s was about that. How can France both have a strong common agricultural policy and a weak commission? Well, at a time when France pushes again for more internal cohesion and solidarity at the EU level, as exemplified in particular by the Next Generation EU success, or industrial policy, or the Green Deal, it's very clear that it would be very hard to continue pushing for these elements of more European cohesion and I would say thickness of the European project without accepting a measure of increased integration, knowing that France, of course, is more reluctant than Germany to go in the direction of supranational integration. And we've seen we've already detected signs of that when the coalition compact was published in Berlin, and the French saw that once again the Germans, which they hadn't done since Schröder and Joschka Fischer, the Germans are again pushing for a federalist approach to European institutions. Well, this of course is not an easy thing for the French, as you imagine. Where I wouldn't say sovereignism, but intergovernmentalism remains a strong characteristic of France's approach to European institutions. So we'll have to watch how this plays in the next few years. How do we have more Europe, a more sovereign Europe, without being a less sovereign member state in Europe? That is something, of course, that the French will ask themselves. And finally, I would say the third issue that has to be watched, will have to be watched over the next few years, is the issue of the French model, political model, economic model, cultural model. The French political model is one of a presidential monarchy, and in spite of willingness to change this, it's very hard to change it, and Macron has experienced that himself. How is that compatible with more European unification? The German political model paradigm is much more compatible with the European Union model because of its decentralized, federalist approach to politics. And this is, of course, something that hinders French leadership in the EU. And so the issue of the French institutional model, political model, is an important one. And so is, by the way, the issue of cultural or societal, France's cultural or societal model, which is also likely to be increasingly challenged by France's belonging to the EU. This is perhaps something that is shared in a way in very different terms, of course, in the two countries, between France and Poland. If you take the issue of Islam, for example, of course, it's played very differently in France and Poland. In France, the issue of laïcité is an important one. And there is a feeling in some sectors of French public opinion that this notion is not understood by European partners, even by the US, the American or the British. And this notion of religious neutrality, which is very important in the French political model, is a challenge for France's leadership in the EU. There is a growing lack of understanding with regard to what some others see as religious intolerance, but the French only see as the protection of the Republican model. So, in an increasingly integrated, cohesive, perhaps federal Europe, the notion of the French cultural model is one that is going to be very important to monitor. So, to conclude my talk, and I've been too long already, France's role in European construction and Franco-German relations have always been a challenge that has created major dilemmas for France. And I'm confident that the current phase of Franco-German rapprochement and European relaunch can continue, but one should not overlook the challenges ahead. I'll stop there, and of course, I'm happy to discuss those issues with you and answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Frédéric Bozo, for explaining us this relationship between French and Germany. As we see, it's more about complementarity, not rivalry. So now we invite you to comments or to the questions. I see we have already one question from Maria Hanjak on the chat. She asked, as we can see, President Macron stays very active in preventing escalation in the Ukrainian crisis. I want to ask you, what is the opinion of French authorities and society on the huge German project Nord Stream 2, especially in context of actions taken by Russia in previous days? Very interesting question.
Indeed, and it's a question that to some extent has already been answered by the German government. I've just seen that the German government has announced the suspension of the certification of Nord Stream. Now, of course, it sounds like a technical decision, and it is a technical decision, but with very strong political ramifications. I don't see how Nord Stream can enter into can actually start in the current context, and the Germans know that full well. Now, how do the French react to that? Well, it's a very complex situation because of the closeness of Franco-German relations, because France, and France's firms to some extent are stakeholders in Nord Stream. But in political terms, it's very clear that the French government is not equally supportive of Nord Stream as the German government. And there were signs of that over the past 2 years, in particular when the issue was discussed between the French and the Poles. It's clear that the French have been trying to take account of positions in Central and Eastern Europe to the project, and try to explain to the Germans that that sentiment has to be taken into account. So it's hard to say. I mean, I would think that at some point this is going to be this issue will be set aside simply because it's not current. Would it come back? I don't know. Much will depend, of course, on the political situation in Europe, on the political situation in Germany. In a sense, this is reminiscent of what happened in 2014, when the situation was the reverse. At the time, maybe you recall that when the Crimea issue took place in 2014, on the Donbass issue, and sanctions were devised. There was strong pressure on the French government to cancel the sale of two warships to Russia. And François Hollande had to eventually yield to pressure and cancel that sale of two warships to Russia. Well, it's the reverse situation today. Clearly, Germany is under pressure to discontinue Nord Stream. And I don't see how this Nord Stream issue is going to be, activated in the current situation anyway. In the long run, it's too early to say, of course. But this is one of the issues in which France and Germany do not see eye to eye very clearly, even though for political reasons, the French are not probably too public on this.
Thank you very much. I see on the chat we have already several questions. So the second one is from Jan Schott. Did those differences between France and Germany played role in past centuries, for example, during Franco-Prussian War?
Well, this is going way back, I would say, the situation, the European situation was, of course, very different at the time. So I would say that, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 is largely irrelevant to the current situation. But of course, it's part of the historic, context backdrop of the Franco-German rapprochement. So this is a relationship in which historical consciousness is very important on both sides and remains so, and happily so. I mean, it's very important, of course, to recall that one of the main reasons for Franco-German cooperation is reconciliation. This remains, of course, very true today, even though the generations are passing and that kind of sentiment is much less prevalent. But it's still politically very important, I would say.
Yes, it's all about history, yes.
Absolutely.
So we have another question from Simon Grippon. Mr. Professor, with the emergence of new countries in EU and their task for recognition in the institutions such as Poland recently, how do you think the German-French relationship will be impacted by this potential reform of the EU?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that Macron started out in 2017 mostly overlooking countries like Poland or Hungary because of the ideological disconnect between his own liberal reformist European agenda, integrationist agenda, and the divergence of Poland or Hungary towards sovereignism, even in some ways calling into question the rule of law, etc., etc. But it's also clear that Macron has realized over the past few years that since these countries are to stay in the EU, and nobody imagines 1 second that there will be a Polexit, there will have to be compromises. And if France wants to remain a leading power in the EU, it has to try to find compromise with those countries rather than antagonize them. So, but by the way, the same has been true in Germany. I mean, when you look at the way Mrs. Merkel has been dealing with Mr. Orban, for example, it was very much the same. How not to antagonize those countries and regimes, without relinquishing one's own, ideals or European preferences. So, I would say that whatever happens after the election in France, you will see continued attempts by Paris to try to the extent possible to find common ground with a country like Poland rather than to antagonize those countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And another question from Jakub Knop. what is your view on German decision to dump nuclear power? In hindsight, and given the ongoing crisis with Russia, this decision only gave Putin an additional leverage and endangered European unity.
Well, I think your question provides the answer. We now see how probably reckless and not thought through the decision to stop nuclear energy in Germany in 2011 was taken. It is clearly now in terms of the transition towards sustainability, etc., a major issue, and the dossier of the green taxonomy, basically is speaks volumes about this Franco-German disconnect. What you've seen in the past few weeks is, after hesitation on the part of the French government, an all-out decision to bet on the nuclear at a time when Germany seems to double down on renewable energies, claiming that gas can serve as a transition. But of course, Putin and the Ukraine crisis, casts a huge shadow of doubt on whether this is actually a good strategy. So, of course, for political reasons in the coalition in Germany, this is not something that is being admitted. But those German choices of 2011 are clearly a problem today, certainly for the EU at large, probably for Franco-German relations, and I would argue for Germany itself, since it's not absolutely clear at all that the transition model that is being put forth in Germany is actually sustainable.
Thank you. So another question from Beatrice Austoni. Mr. Professor, do you think the improving in the relationship between France and Germany is mainly due to Macron's policies, or a general change in the two countries' public opinion might play a fundamental role too? For example, if Macron lost the future election, would it be safe to say that French people have gained a different mindset? Therefore, it would be a big deal to elect another president.
Well,
maybe Zemmour.
Well, there are lessons to be drawn from history. Franco-German relations have usually survived political changes in both countries. Remember, I would say that the previous era of Franco-German success under Kohl and Mitterrand was played out between a socialist president and the conservative chancellor. So, national interest, European interest transcends politics in both countries. There's no doubt. The question is, what are the limits of that paradigm? I mean, if in April, the French president is neither Macron nor Pécresse, in other words, not a mainstream candidate, what does that mean for Franco-German relations? Very hard to say, very unpredictable. On the other hand, when you look at Marine Le Pen's electoral program, what you see basically is a sort of normalization of her options, taking into account the fact that any strong divergence with Germany or Europe at large is not, something that the French electorate is really interested in. So she has normalized her program to a very large extent, to the point of, in a way, being reminiscent of Mitterrand's program of 1981. I mean, she's nothing more. She's not an extreme rightist anymore. She's simply, a quasi-socialist Republican candidate, who is critical of the dominant economic model and wants to change it, but certainly not at the expense of the continuation of the European experience of the Franco-German relationship. So again, I don't think this is a very likely option at all. But if it were to happen, I mean, you would have to ask yourself whether this is indeed a major political shock, or whether that shock is going to be absorbed as it was in 1981.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And another question about China. How divergent are the views of both countries on China? I wonder if France is also of the opinion that Wandel der Handel is a sound approach, or are they opting for a more assertive approach?
Well, I'm not even sure that Wandel durch Handel is still seen as a credible option by the Germans. I mean, the Germans have evolved rather strongly in the past few years when dealing with China. It all started I think in 2016 when there was a realization that it was the KUKA issue when Chinese bought a major German technological firm, that there was a risk of Germany being, literally looted of its industrial and technological assets by China. So a growing realization that China is a competitor rather than a customer. So Germany has changed when it comes to China, I think. And of course, the major difference between the two countries is that France is much less exposed to trade with China than Germany is, because of the importance of exports to China by Germany, which is not the case for France, but much less the case. So there's this structural difference. But in political terms, I would say that there is a growing convergence on the need to basically take China for what it is, that is a systemic competitor that has to be dealt with accordingly. So I don't see major divergences between France and Germany on this issue, frankly.
Okay, thank you very much. And now the question from Michał Augustynowicz. Mr. Professor, what is the view of the Weimar Triangle format in France? Yes, it was my question also. What do you think? Because we see the relation between France and Germany from Polish perspective, and this is more about the Weimar Triangle, because when it was created, it was dominated by the European idea. And this idea was to include Poland in the NATO and in the EU. And now the situation is different, because we are talking about the EU crisis, about this. We are all concerned about this rule of law, and what is the future of this format of this Weimar Triangle? Maybe maybe it is also a good forum for Ukrainian crisis, because we do not see any engagement from Normandy format. What is your opinion?
No, I think that's right, and you actually saw that in Berlin last week when there was a meeting with the Polish Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, and the French President, which was a sort of resurrection of, as I understood it, of the Weimar Triangle format. So it's very clear that the geopolitical context and the Ukraine crisis, which really is a Russia crisis, gives more importance to the Weimar Triangle than it has had for years, and tends to, in a sense, overshadow the rule of law issue, which made that triangle, inert for the past several years. So yes, on the one hand, the geopolitical context helps, giving more relevance, or again relevance, to the Weimar Triangle, but of course, much will depend on Poland and its internal domestic decisions on the rule of law. Here, of course, I'm not a specialist of your country, but I would be interested to know, what the prospects are for solving these issues in the next few months and years. And I read conflicting, analyses of this. But so, to make a long story short, yes, geopolitics revived the Weimar Triangle, but there will be a limit to that revival if Poland, continues to defy basically the rest of the EU in value and in value terms. But I think the French and probably the German leaders certainly see it as a valuable tool to try to bridge the gap with countries like Poland, both in geopolitical terms and in value terms. So my guess would be that there will be a willingness to use that tool to the extent possible, both in Berlin and in Paris.
Yes, thank you very much. And we have another questions from Elżbieta Dybcio-Wojciechowska. She asked about She asked about Belarus. President Macron and EU understood the Belarusian provocation with migrants at Polish border. Do you think Poland will be helped by EU if the crisis with Ukrainian migrants breaks out?
Certainly, there is no doubt. If only because this is a very different migration crisis than the one that happened in Belarus. At the time, it was about Lukashenko using migrants from the Middle East to destabilize the EU and Poland in particular. And so, the reaction was basically in Poland to try to stop that as much as possible. That's when the issue of building a wall came up in the debate. That, of course, raises issues in countries like France and Germany. But in the case of Ukraine, it's a very different situation. You're talking about Ukrainians moving to Poland, and I don't imagine that Poland will try to build a wall to prevent that. So it's about helping Poland dealing with that circumstance in a situation which is entirely, let's say, legitimate. Unlike the Belarus situation. So these are two very different situations. So my short answer is yes, of course. There will be solidarity with Poland.
And another question about EU strategic compass, which start with German presidency and will finish with French presidency. In your opinion, will actions follow the rhetoric, and do you support French efforts to bolster European strategic standing in parallel to NATO?
Yes, that's an important question. I won't be able to, respond specifically on the details of the compass because I'm not privy to the details. But, in very general terms, strategic terms, there are two ways to analyze the current Ukraine-Russia situation. One is, basically to say, well, this only proves that there is nothing except NATO in town in terms of providing security to countries like Poland or even the EU at large. So, of course, basically the Ukraine crisis reminds us that NATO is the pillar of European security. There's no doubt. On the other hand, even though it's early on the crisis, to make postmortems and to analyze the US approach to the crisis, it remains to be seen whether the lessons learned from that crisis in the next few months or even years will be indeed that only NATO and the US can provide credible security guarantees to Europe. The way the US has been dealing with the Ukraine crisis, it seems to me, has been clearly dominated by reluctance. This is a crisis that the Americans did not want to deal with in the first instance, and have been forced to deal with to give credibility to their recommitment to NATO after Trump. But that reluctance shows in a way. It's clear that I mean, you may wonder whether the U.S. tactics of information war, for example, that has been on display in the past few days or weeks, was to the best European interest. Even the Ukrainians have raised this issue. Even the Ukrainian president, has voiced his discomfort with those. It's as if the U.S. was experimenting in new hybrid wars, in the Ukrainian conflict, which, is reminiscent that one of the risks for Europe, for the EU, even for countries like Poland or the Baltic states, is that Europe becomes the playfield of US-Russian rivalries, as was the case during the Cold War, but in a radically different situation in which the US is less and less committed to European security because of its other agendas elsewhere, especially in the Indo-Pacific. So I'm not convinced that the Ukraine crisis will be seen when it's over, if it's ever over in the next few years, as a sort of vindication of the continuing absolute imperative of US and NATO as the only pillars of European security. In other words, there is room for more EU role in security. I think the sense of Macron's diplomatic initiatives of the past few weeks was about, basically saying it's impossible for the EU, for the Europeans to remain on the sidelines as the Russians and the Americans discuss major issues of European security. And I think that it is something that even countries like Poland or the Baltic states can accept and understand. So I think there is room for more European strategic activism. This cannot be only the US dealing with Russia at a time when the US is really less and less interested in doing so.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have another question from Pelum Pshala. From Tomasz Mroziewicz. Professor, do you think economical balance is ever possible between Germany and France? This would be, France would need to catch up with innovation. What should change in French economy to catch up with Germany?
Well, that's a very good question, and one that I cannot answer in detail because I'm not an economist, but it's very clear that Macron's strategy is about reviving the French economy by making internal reforms. And the issue of reindustrialization, of course, is very important to that effect. Clearly, the idea is that France will not, again become an industrial power of the 20th century, the way Germany is. And if there is to be a rebalancing, it's going to be in the new economy, in the tech sector, in the industrial tech sector. And so it's the issue of attractivity of France, innovation. What you're beginning to see is the beginning of a revival of French industry, both in traditional sectors like automobile, but also in more future-oriented sectors like tech or industrial tech, so to say. My feeling is yes, it is possible. Of course, it is possible, if only because there has been a belated understanding in French public opinion, in the public debate, that this issue has been neglected, and that you cannot thrive in the EU, in the Eurozone, without taking seriously the issue of competitiveness, attractivity, etc. And so one of the issues of the upcoming election in France is whether we continue or not in this direction. This will be a very important test, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe two last questions. One from Pelum Pshala. Do you believe that the lack of attention and proper strategy of EU leadership towards the Eastern and Southeastern European countries has accelerated the reactivation of Russian activities in these regions?
Well, it's very clear that there's a dilemma for the EU and for a country like France. I mean, do we is enlargement still a valid option? And of course, there is enlargement fatigue, and there's been enlargement fatigue over the past few years. The Turkish issue, of course, is behind us now. Nobody believes that Turkey will be a member of the EU, but the Western Balkan is an important issue. And it's clear that not enlarging creates opportunities for countries like Russia or China. So there is a huge dilemma here. Clearly, for a country like France, it's a major dilemma. It's also a dilemma for its leadership in the EU. France's reluctance to enlarge the EU to the Western Balkan, of course, is not shared by other countries. Some do share it, others don't. So that's the only answer I could provide. It is a major dilemma.
Okay, and another one from Jakub Knop. Do you know the extent to which German and French are contributing to negotiation to restore Iranian nuclear deal?
I don't know the details, but the answer is yes. They have a huge interest in doing so. But of course, there are vexing issues that are very difficult to overcome. But it is clearly a major interest of the EU countries, France, Germany, and in fact, Britain as well, to resurrect the deal.
And the last one question from the chat, from Tomasz Mroziewicz. He asked about the last visit of President Macron in Russia. There was mysterious statement of President Macron. There are certain mistakes of the past. Additionally, in German, there were found documents promising Russia not to extend NATO. Do you think this is beginning of Western Europe start to admitting Russian has rights to claim revisionism requests?
Well, this is clearly the heart of the issue. I mean, so I don't know exactly what statement this is by Macron. I haven't read his statement on this, but it's clear, of course, and he's very candid about it. And he was so when he invited Putin to his southern France resort in 2019 to try a reset of relations with Russia. That he believes that indeed, yes, mistakes were made in dealing with Russia in the past 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. That doesn't mean, that the conclusion is a revisionist one. It's simply an issue of let's say, of lucidity. So there are instances in which, indeed, without being a Putin supporter, it is true that Russia's security interests have been neglected or dismissed. This, in my view, does not include in the NATO enlargement, certainly not to Poland, which was in the order of things. But it's clear that the way this was done did not sufficiently take into account, if not Russia's security interests, then at least the possibility that this becomes once more an issue for Russia. So you have to look at the whole series of events from German unification to the recognition of the independence of Kosovo, through the issue of Kosovo in 1999, Iraq in 2002 and 3. Perhaps even Libya in 2011. It's clear that Russia has been taken for granted by the West. There's no doubt about that, and that the West could have done better at making sure that Russia would be kept on board. If you want, I think Macron asks who lost Russia and why. I think it's a legitimate question. And I don't think that from that legitimate question derives any kind of revisionism or legitimation of revisionism. But it's a legitimate question. If you want to elaborate it, to evolve a strategy towards Russia, you have to take into account that kind of realities. Another question is, if you look at the Ukraine NATO issue, for example, you recall, of course, that in 2008 at Bucharest, the Americans were pushing for a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia, and that it was Merkel and Sarkozy who said no. Their view was clearly that, playing the card of Ukraine NATO membership was dangerous because of Russia resentment. But the way that was solved is, with hindsight, rather disastrous, because you have, the worst of both worlds. Ukraine was denied, membership in the membership action plan, and was left out in the cold. At the same time, the NATO communique said Ukraine will be a member of NATO at some point, will be a member of NATO. So you had, the worst of two worlds. One, you had a statement that was, of course, seen by Russia as unacceptable. And two, you had the denial of any kind of security guarantees to Ukraine. I think this is, to a large extent, one of the origins of the present situation. So, I would, again, without taking sides, without, deriving any kind of lessons or let's say, guidelines, there has been a certain amount of amateurism in the way all these things have been decided over in the past 20, 25 years. There's no doubt.
Thank you very much. And I think with this conclusion, we will stop here. Thank you very much, Frédéric Bozo, for this very
pleasure
and interesting debate and lecture and session of questions and answer. Thank you very much. And we invite you to our next seminar of 8th of March with Professor Anne-Marie Doust and Professor Olivier Barsalou from University of Quebec à Montreal. And they will present Women, Gender and Security in International Relations and International Law, a Dialogue Under Construction. So thank you very much, and we wish you a very nice evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.